Now that the delicious Last Course DLC is out, it's high time to rank every Cuphead boss. I'll be playing on normal difficulty and splitting up every mid-boss from King Dice as its own. As you'd expect, this list is based on easiest to hardest, so with that, let's get her ranked. 40. Pirouletta. If you have the Smoke Bomb charm, there is virtually no challenge whatsoever. Pirouletta shoots some balls in the air, but they all come down in a line and as predictable as can be. Then you just dash between her legs when she's spinning around, and that's it. 39. Chips Bettigan. Imagine the Yellow Devil from Mega Man 1, but way slower and no laser eyeball. That's basically all this mini-boss is. The chips randomly swing from one side of the screen to the other. 38. Phear Lap. A skeleton horse dude gives you some gifts, and shooting them releases a bunch of horseshoes. The foreground kind of makes this challenging, but the horseshoes move so slowly that it barely makes a difference. There's also horses on the bottom, but they're so out of the way that they'll never be a problem. 37. Mr. Wheezy. I can almost smell the smoke, and it smells awful. Cigarettes float up from the bottom, and Wheezy spits fireballs. If using the Smoke Bomb charm, you can easily switch from left to right since Wheezy likes to move around a bunch. The only slightly challenging part is the fireball patterns and nothing else. 36. Hopus Pocus. This bunny boy either sends card suits across the screen or conjures a ring of rabbit skulls. Both of these are really easy to avoid if you have the smoke ball charm enabled and know how to parry, which you should at this point in the game. 35. The Pawns. The first of the King's mini-bosses. You just have to parry the top of a bunch of pawns. It's a little hard to avoid them running, but there's not much else to it. 34. King Dice. Since we're just talking about the King Dice fight at the end, honestly, his difficulty varies depending on how much HP you're able to build up. For some reason, I was struggling to jump over the first card without getting hit, so I needed to have at least 4 HP going in as well as invincibility. With this strategy, I was able to take him out, but it was the only way. Getting that much HP without choking on the mini-boss isn't the easiest task, but we're not counting those for this boss. 33. The Queen. Parry off cannons to hit the Queen in the background. She'll throw a variety of jewelry at you, but for the most part, it's easy to avoid. The only difficult part is aiming the cannon at the right spot. This is another great idea for a boss battle. It's too bad it's not harder, seeing as it's the final one of the King's Gauntlet. 32. The Knight. You'll parry the top of the Knight's hair, and to be honest, I kind of struggled with this one at first. It all comes down to paying attention to the horse's face. Once you learn what his expressions do, you can fairly easily avoid his attacks, although he does take a good amount of hits. 31. Pip and Dot. A die is swinging while spitting out 20-sided die. The floor is also moving with some spikes to avoid. Frankly, the floor is really the only portion that was tripping me up. Otherwise, this would have been the easiest boss. I do find it interesting how both sides of the die seem to hate each other just based off their expressions. 30. Mr. Chimes. By far the longest lasting mini-boss. Match up the cards and the monkey goes crazy. He'll slam his cymbals and some music notes come out. It's not really difficult to avoid any of this, it just takes a while to match up all the cards. 29. Goopy Le Grande. Our little blue slimy gumball does a bunch of bouncing and slings his head forward for a big punch. After eating a jelly bean, he gets larger and does some more jumping and punching. At this point, you've unalived him and his grave is attacking by smacking down at the ground. The jumping patterns are a little awkward at first, especially when he gets bigger, but even still, it's not too terribly bad. 28. The Root Pack. All 3 phases are fairly simple, starting with Sal Sputter. He spits out slow-moving meatballs, and then out comes Ollie Bowl. As all onions do, he cries deadly tears, although calling them deadly is a stretch since avoiding them is ridiculously easy. If you don't shoot Ollie, he'll dig himself back into the ground, and Horace Radish comes out with Chauncey Chantani. I never even knew this secret phase existed until looking it up. I love that Cuphead has hidden stuff like this. But why is the carrot a hypnotist? You're asking the wrong guy. I don't know, but his attacks are easy to avoid. But fighting with the radish adds a little more difficulty since you have to keep jumping over it while avoiding the carrots, but even still, it's a cakewalk. 27. Tipsy Troop. The first of the mini-bosses for King Dice. You just have to avoid a bunch of liquid and one-eyed bad olives. Despite its simple premise, all 3 glasses at once can be a bit tricky, but it is just one section. It really just comes down to the liquid that gets in the way, but even then it's not too bad. 26. Mangosteen. An 8-ball shoots some orbs and billiard chalk attacks you. Of all the mini-bosses, this is probably the hardest because it has the most things to avoid at once. But even so, the chalk flips away slowly and same with the orbs. 25. The Bishop. Unlight the candles to make the spinning bishop head turn pink for a parry. There's also some smoke balls that fly around, but the real challenge is the head itself. Its patterns get faster and faster and more sporadic, so you really need to pay attention to get through this one. 24. Mortimer Freeze. The only guy I know that can pull a whale out of thin air. You'll start by avoiding some icicles and cards, which frankly is all pretty easy to do. Then he'll turn into a snow monster which rolls around, and also becomes a fridge which fires ice cubes, and there's some spikes that protrude from the ground. Once again, these projectiles are pretty slow for Cuphead standards. After that is the hardest phase. The battlefield turns into 5 rotating platforms, and you fight an evil snowflake. There's this eyeball attack that fires lasers, which can be a bit tricky to avoid, but that's the only part that I kind of struggled with. 23. Secret Devil Boss. There's not really an official name yet, but you basically fight the devil after defeating him from the base game. There's an angel and a devil, and whichever way you're facing determines where the devil will be. If you face in one direction the whole time, it makes this battle dramatically easier. The fire waves won't hurt you, and less fireballs spawn. It feels like this boss is some sort of lore leading to Cuphead 2 in the future. It's all so mysterious. 22. Cagney Carnation, or as Tetra calls him, Plant Boy. I love how Cagney just jams out in between attacks. It's a lot of fun to watch. He charges his beautiful face forward and cranks out a bunch of sycamore seeds which grow into terrifying plants. After a while, he gets frustrated, grows shark teeth, and the bottom ground is covered in his spiky vines. This is such a cool transformation. Even if the second phase is a bit easier than the first, it feels more intense. 2 of the 3 platforms constantly get strangled in vines, but there's plenty of time to see it happen before it does. 21. Baroness Von Bon Bon. One of the most unique fights due to the bosses themselves being completely random. You don't even fight Baroness until the end, but instead take on 3 of the 5 candy bosses first. Colonel Von Pop is just floating around the screen, minding his own business. Sergeant Gumbo Gumball is literally just running around, spitting some gumballs out of his head. Lord Godpacker is essentially the same as the candy corn guy, and after all the mini-fights, the castle itself crawls towards you. Baroness will throw her head, and some menthols roll out of the doors. It's one of the longer fights, but none of the bosses are all that challenging. They move pretty slowly with predictable patterns. 20. Cala Maria. I don't know why, but I think I only died like 2 or 3 times before finishing this boss, and this is near the end game. She spits out some fish in a fairly basic pattern, then picks up a fire fishy that spews more flames. This squirty fella is supposed to make this harder, but the water pressure is pretty mild. The Puffer Gang is kind of a threat once it's paired with Cala's other attacks, but even then it's pretty manageable. With the second phase, she gets zapped by some eels, and the eels shoot bullet hell if you don't destroy them in time. Although honestly, she's pretty weak in this phase, so it's better to just knock her out quickly and move to the end. The final phase is slightly challenging because the walls get so narrow and the green laser thing can still freeze you for a moment, but even then it's fairly simple. 19. The Rook, or you could call him the Executioner. While sharpening his axe, some heads and skulls fly towards you, and you have to parry the pink heads back at him. Sparks will start to head your way, and you'll have to hit the parried head in the right direction multiple times to hit the Rook. It's a pretty cool battle, and fairly tough as well. 18. Moonshine Mob. You fight a bunch of bugs breaking the law because they're selling moonshine. The concept is charming, considering alcohol was against the law in this time period. There's even ant cops that pop in to spray pesticide. After that, you'll find a ladybug in this gramophone, and then you fight this anteater that eats bugs and spits them back out. There's even a fake knockout screen, as you'll also need to destroy the announcer snail. I found the music notes hard to avoid, but that was really about it. The anteater's tongue generally stays out of your way, so it's only a slightly challenging boss. 17. Ribby and Croaks. A couple of martial art trained frogs want to tussle it out, starting with some fireballs and fish-shaped energy waves. Since they aren't moving, it's not too challenging to start. With the second phase, Ribby rolls to the other side and starts dishing out radioactive gumballs while Croaks turns into a fan of fury. Again, this phase isn't terribly hard if you can keep yourself in the middle. The final part is a bit trickier, as Ribby rolls into Croaks' mouth and then turns into a slot machine? Okay, that makes sense, I guess. You have to parry off the crank and a bunch of spiked platforms fly out of the machine. You might get the red ones with flames. I've always found this the hardest just because there isn't a lot of screen to run around in. The orange platforms aren't too bad once you learn the ball's patterns. Honestly, it's the stupid coins that throw me off the most. It's like my brain doesn't even notice them since I'm so fixated on the platforms. 16. Sally Stageplay. You certainly fight Sally. She blows kisses and it turns into parryable hearts, and she can teleport all over the stage while throwing fans and spin kicking. For being an Inkwell Aisle 3, this boss takes a nosedive in difficulty on all fronts. The second phase has babies throwing bottles out the window and little rat cars drive around, but otherwise nothing else changes. With the third phase, she turns into a goddess meteorologist and strikes all sorts of weather conditions like lightning and waves. At the end, you just avoid her parasol and roses falling from the ground. So I guess she also died like Goopy and we're fighting her afterlife? And to think the secret phase is even more messed up. If you stand on both of the babies, her husband dies and she starts crying over his tombstone. So instead of babies throwing bottles, nuns throw crosses. But then her husband comes back as a god, so it's a little harder than before. I just can't believe how much effort has gone into the secrets. There's so much lore in just this one fight. 15. Glumstone the Giant. A big giant man has a cauldron in his mouth that releases deadly gases, and he also calls for help from geese and a bear. You've also got a bunch of gnomes that fire little yellow blasts at you, so this phase can be a bit much. But after that, he rips off his beard, which looks very painful, and plays sock puppets. A ball bounces back and forth, and more gnomes burst from the ground. He eventually decides to eat you, and you'll attack his cardia while surviving off crocodile skulls. Needless to say, this boss is one of the tougher ones. Just the sheer amount of obstacles that are hurled at you make this one challenging. 14. Hilda Berg. You know how people say that words hurt? That's taken quite literally, as Hilda's ha can hurt Cuphead, as well as these purple blimp thingies. She'll fly forward revealing a constellation, which tells you which form she'll take, one of those being a bull that lunges at you, or even female twins that release a powerful crystal ball. After enough damage, she starts trembling in pain and turns into a moon. This is where gets a touch tricky. These UFOs come out of nowhere and shoot pinpoint lasers. It's that on top of the stars is what makes this so difficult. This is the boss that tells you to get good at multitasking or give up. At the very least, there's not that many stars to avoid, so it's manageable after some tries. 13. Rumor Honeybottoms. Before fighting Rumor, a security bee comes in to lay out bombs while other worker bees fly in. I'm so glad that the worker bees have suitcases and look sad. They really captured the essence perfectly. After this, Rumor comes out and starts spitting bullet bills, pink spear things, and the scariest triangles you'll ever see. She'll turn on a plane and shoot lock-on fists and buzzsaws. Constantly jumping up kind of reminds me of Icicle Mountain, but in a good way. It's a pretty fun fight, and not that difficult after a handful of tries. 12. Esther Winchester. Instead of fighting a cowgirl, you fight a cow that's a girl. You gotta love Cuphead for its puns, and good golly gracious is this fight tough. It's one of those pay attention to 80 things at once kind of bosses. You have to worry about snake oil, birds dropping dynamite, a big cactus, and flying donkeys that spit spikes at you. And this is just the beginning. Next, Esther vacuums a bunch of money into a machine and releases it with big safes that explode more money. If you get through that, Esther accidentally turns himself into a sausage that shoots meat at you with random cans of sausage floating around. Then Esther goes into a big can with peppers and more sausages flying across the screen. It's total chaos and a little hard to keep track of everything. 11. Beppi the Clown. For me, this is the boss that started tearing through my lives in anger. The first 3 phases weren't even the issue. Beppi starts on this roller coaster and kind of trudges his way towards you, but you also have these ducks on the top that you have to keep shooting at or you'll get Smeckledorfed. Then he turns into a balloon and sends out these balloon dog heads, and you also have to avoid the roller coaster. The dogs can be hard to pay attention to because you gotta keep your eyes on the coaster while jumping over pedestrians. The part with the horse isn't that bad. It depends on your RNG with which horse you get, and also when the coaster comes back. The final phase is Beppi's chair swing. It doesn't look like much, but when the coaster is seriously flying down the road and a bunch of penguins start chucking baseballs at your ass, it's way harder than it looks when all those factors are combined. 10. Chef Saltbaker. A chef that even Gordon Ramsay would fear. He hurls sugar cubes, limes, strawberries, and dough at you just to start. What's so fascinating about this phase is all these ingredients are alive and they're terrified that they're being used as weapons. After that, he grabs you by the hands and a bunch of pepper shakers start sneezing at you while also attacking the chef at the same time. After that, you end up in a salt field and the chef turns into some sort of salt tornado that jumps around, and at the very end, you must shoot at his heart while jumping off what I think is falling ice? It's a pretty insane fight and damn hard too. It's mostly the first 2 phases due to the large amount of obstacles on the screen. 9. The Howling Aces, dogs that are dogfighting. Man, this game loves its puns. The first phase starts with some sort of bulldog that hurls tennis balls, bone tattoos, and yarn balls from the cat. These obstacles aren't too bad, but the tennis balls tend to get in your way more often than you'd think. After that, a bunch more dogs circle around you firing little letters. But the real challenge comes in with this massive plane that has paws for its wings and fires deadly lasers at you. But what's worse is the screen flips 90 degrees, which also alters your controls. It's really wonky getting used to this, and adds a higher level of difficulty. There's even a secret phase that's slightly easier. By shooting the 4 dogs to the point of them releasing gray smoke but not killing them, you'll bring the massive jet to you sooner and fight those same dogs from there. It's a lot easier than all the rotating, that's for sure. 8. The Devil. While not the hardest boss, he definitely has the most intense transformations. There are so many attacks that it's hard to remember them all. He turns into a goat and extends his arms to attack from both sides of the screen. He's also got crystal balls and a little purple devil bitch that tries to get in your way. His head can become a spider that lunges down at you. And this is just some of them. In phase 2, you dip into a hole and oh my god, his head is the size of the stage. He'll start throwing axes at you. Rings of fire fly down to hit your limited number of platforms. The bat bombs make huge explosions. It's a lot to take in. Phase 3 is the same, but you have 3 platforms instead of 5. Plus, there are demons that fly in to spit skulls at you. The final phase really upsets the devil as he begins to cry blood. But it's the easiest part if you save your invincibility, and that's the whole boss. The ending is almost anticlimactic just because it gets easier at the end, but the expressiveness of the devil is unparalleled. This asshole has put us through some grueling bosses, and it turns out he's not even as strong as some of them, which in a way is also quite satisfying. 7. Djimmi the Great. It's Will Smith, but he's red. By far one of the most dynamic shooting stages in the game. Djimmi summons a treasure chest, which can be absolute hell or moderately annoying. The flying Cassacarbs aren't the worst thing to avoid. The other forms are much more irritating. After some hits, the level turns into a side-scroller and you have to blast away the blocks with faces on them. A sarcophagus appears next, revealing a slimy version of Djimmi. He can shoot planets out of his eyes now, so that's cool. After that, you'll fight Cuphead that fires tons of bullets, and honestly, it's the floating genie head that sucks. This thing also shoots a sporadic amount of bullets and makes this boss a pain since there's no consistency. For the final phase, Djimmi gets big and a bunch of pyramids surround Cuphead. You'll have to avoid the pyramid lasers and a set of rings from Jimmy's mind. This is an intricate and tough boss, but on top of that, there's even a secret phase. In phase 4, if you're a mini plane, mini Cuphead appears and you go right to the final phase. Skipping the Cuphead fight might sound great, but it makes the final phase like 10 times harder. 6. Werner Werman, the rat that hangs out in the Campbell's soup can. He fires bombs with leftover fire trails, chucks scraps, and the whole time you see an eye watching you through the cracks. Then you've got the bottle cap phase where Werner attacks with fire streams on the top or bottom, and bottle caps swing towards you, so you have to very carefully navigate your way around both obstacles. This section is really difficult because the bottle caps come in so erratically. It's just disorienting trying to keep yourself safe. And then at the end, you take on Katzenwagen since he eats Warren in quotations, but let's be honest, it's just Tom from Tom and Jerry. It is, look at him. This phase isn't too bad if you can take out the ghost quickly, and pay attention to the cat's paws that swoop from one side or the other. In terms of difficulty, it's pretty split down the middle. 5. Phantom Express. This ghostly boss requires the right weapons to get through, and even then, it's still pretty tough. Blind Spectre ironically shoots eyeballs at you, and the main gimmick is controlling your central platform by parrying off these little wheels. This pink soap will also move these wheels, so you have to constantly parry the soap or you'll probably get screwed over. The second phase is the conductor throwing hands, and if you're careful, this part isn't too shabby, but phase 3 is rough. These lollipop ghouls keep spraying lightning across the level, and this is also with extra ghosts and their pink skulls. I had to deliberately save invincibility for this phase because it can be so unforgiving. And at the end, you take on the train itself, which can suddenly run like a horse. Man, Cuphead gets so absurd. You have to parry his tail to open up the heart while also avoiding flames and rings of bones. This is another boss with a ton going on at once. It takes a lot of practice to come up with your own strategies. 4. Wally Warbles. I hate this bird. Now we're getting to the bosses that had me cursing up a storm. There's only 3 phases, but they're all grueling to tackle. The first one has some bullets from a glove and eggs that explode on impact. You've also got some birds to shoot down, so while the action is fast, you can get used to it with practice. The second phase is just stupid. Tons of feathers fly off Wally, and you have to dodge your way around all of them. After dying on this boss so many times, you're much more likely to choke, even if you've already figured out the pattern to avoid these. Then the bird starts flying around in a nest with a bunch of eggs protecting him, and these eggs are deceptively hard to avoid. They come out of nowhere when you least expect it. Even on the way to the hospital, you're still fighting Wally since the doctors chuck pills, bones, and all sorts of shit your way. It's just never ending. This boss is relentless. 3. Captain Brinerybeard. You need like 5 eyeballs to pay attention to everything happening. I dread this boss. You've probably noticed this barrel that's chilling on the dock at all times. It is a nuisance the whole time. It never goes away. You know you're in for a doozy when this small barrel is a problem. Brinerybeard starts by firing some pellets at you. This phase is fine and all, it's when the sea animals come in. A shark can charge onto the dock and take a bite at you, the barrel and ship lunges cannonballs, a squid squeezes out deadly ink. All this crap happens simultaneously. And for the final phase, the ship really comes to life and starts shooting long-lasting lasers and fireballs at you. You can avoid these by ducking, but then there's the goddamn barrel that can still hit you. I hate this boss. 2. Dr. Kahl's robot. Oh god, and this boss. I loathe just watching the fight over. It's not even that it's heavy on the multitasking. It's just really hard, like seriously. This robot boss reaches unfun territory. You have to play near perfectly to get through this. Start at the top, let the tracer laser shoot, and immediately go to the abdomen to take out the light bulb drone things. At just the right time, parry the chest spot thing to avoid getting hit. You have to do all this with extreme precision, or at least that's what I figured out. When you do destroy the abdomen, these homing bombs come out that you need to hit, and their explosion hitbox is massive! It's so easy to take a hit just by destroying your target. The head afterwards pushes out a ton of screws, and once you've destroyed the whole thing, you'll shoot at the heart while an arm from behind lunges and fires laser balls. This is just the first phase, and it's already absurd. The second phase isn't too bad, at least with some practice. You basically have to train the bombs like you're playing Call of Duty Zombies and hit the robot head whenever the cycle lines up correctly. And the final phase is ridiculous as well. Dr. Kahl fires radial bursts from a gem while electric walls cover half the stage, and the game has the audacity to add foreground objects to make it harder to see the bursts. I love how creative this boss is, but it is just miserable to fight. 1. Grim Matchstick. I'm assuming most people find the dragon to be the most challenging, or maybe I just didn't figure out the best strats. But let me tell you, I spent the most time fighting this green bitch. I had to beat it on simple first before going back and playing on normal. In this first phase, Grim fires these laser rings, and half the time, I can't see when to parry because I have to jump above the screen. He also attacks with his tail and some swift-moving fireballs. This first section is tricky, but you'll at least figure out patterns over time. The second and third phase are a little different. His tongue stretches out, and walking flames will randomly jump at you. You get a sound and visual cue like most other enemies, but it's very quick with these flames. There's lots of moment where the RNG is set up to where it's impossible to avoid getting hit, so that's really irritating. Then for the final phase, you fight a 3-headed Grim, and they release these tiny flame balls that explode into fast clusters, so it makes more sense to avoid them, which is way harder than you would think. Oh, and these fireballs, they like to move in this slightly diagonal path, which is the most inconvenient way of going about it. And then of course one of the heads shoots deadly fire breath, but at the very least you get more of a warning for it. The challenge really comes down to constantly moving on the tiny clouds. It's like trying to balance on a needle the whole time. It's incredible that every boss in this game manages to be unique, creative, and offer something new that we've never seen before. Let me know what your thoughts are down below, and until next time.